In this lecture, we will learn about using the if, elif, and else control flow statements in Python. Remember that conditions can evaluate to the Boolean values true or false. We can use these values, true and false, to determine which branch of code out of several possibilities gets executed. The advantage that this gives us is that we can write code that will handle the logic for all possible outcomes, and then based on a Boolean value, the proper code block will handle that condition. We already looked at a basic overview of these statements in an earlier lecture. Now we are going to deep dive into them in this video. Recall that an if statement will execute if the condition specified for it evaluates to true. For example, we can check if 3 is less than 5, and if so, print a message to the console. When we run this code, we will notice that the message was output to the console since 3 is less than 5. For the next example, let's flip this if statement around. We will check the condition that 5 is less than 3, which of course we know is false. Now we will run the code again. This time, we will notice that the message was not printed to the console. Another control flow statement that we have access to in Python is the elif statement. Elif is a way of checking another condition in the case that the if statement was false, and the body of code inside of the if statement did not execute. For example, if 5 is not less than 3, we can check another condition, perhaps that 2 is less than 4. Now if we run the code, you will notice that the message in the if statement was not printed since its condition is false, but the message from the elif statement was logged to the console. This is because 2 is less than 4. In an if-elif block, we can have one if statement, but we can have any number of elif statements that you want. Let's change the condition of the elif statement to be if 4 is less than 2, so that it is false. Now we can add another elif statement as part of the if-elif code block that we have here. For example, this elif statement could check if 1 is equal to 0. Of course, we know that this will evaluate to false, so the code inside of it will not be printed when the code is run. Also note that, out of the if and elif statements, only one can execute. So if the if statement is true, the elif code is not run. If the if statement is false, but the first elif is true, it will execute, but then not the elif below it. That is one really important concept of if-else-if code blocks. Even if one of the below statements are true, they will not be executed if an if or elif statement above them is true. For example, let's comment out the code we have been working on, so we can refer to it in a moment, and type another quick example. In this case, we will have an if statement checking if 1 is less than 2. Then we will have an elif statement checking if 2 is less than 3. When we run this code, you will notice that the code inside of the if statement was hit, but not the code inside of the elif statement. Why is this? Shouldn't both messages have been printed to the console? No. The first if or elif statement will execute, and then the rest of the conditions in that code block will be skipped. Note that if we changed the elif statement to another if statement and ran the code, both of the messages will be printed to the console. This is because the second if statement starts a second code block. It is completely separate from the first if statement. A code block starts with an if statement and continues with any elif statements and an else statement if they follow it. The moment we have another if statement, a new code block has been started, and then the same rules apply for any elif or else statements that go with that if statement. If the if statement is false and all elif statements below it are false, there is a control flow statement that we can use called the else statement that will execute no matter what. Unlike the if and elif statements, we do not supply a condition to the else statement. This is because it executes no matter what if the code gets to that point, meaning that none of the if or elif checks were true. At this point, let's delete the example code that we just worked on and uncomment out the other example. All of the if and elif conditions are false in this example, so we could add an else statement at the bottom. When we run the code, you will notice that the else statement was hit, as the message else statement was hit was printed to the console. So why do we use if, elif, and else statements in the code? We use them because they allow us to control the flow of the code execution. However, there is a disadvantage to using if, elif, and else statements. Their weakness is that if there are many alternative blocks of code to be executed, the code can quickly become spaghetti code and get harder to read and manage. We can also nest if, elif, and else statements inside of each other. Let's look at an example of this. Say we have an if statement that checks if 1 is less than 2. Inside of the if statement, we will have an if-else statement. We will say if false, print if statement was hit. Else, print else statement was hit. Okay, let's run the code. First, The if statement checks if 1 is less than 2. Since 1 is less than 2, the code inside of it is executed. We then come to the if-else statement. The condition for the if statement is false, so the else statement is executed. The message else statement was hit was printed to the console. In the next lecture, we will learn about working with for loops in Python.